Andy Austin here with the next chapter from The Rainbow Machine, Tales from a Neurolinguist Journal by Andrew T. Austin. And you can buy this on Amazon and leave a review, which would be really appreciated. Okay, this chapter is entitled The Tinfoil Helmet. And this is essentially just a few pages, which is tips and tricks on working with internal dialogue and changing submodalities of the auditory system. And I give some examples of how we apply this to people with schizophrenia and voice hearing. One of the things that I recognized with NLP practitioners particularly, but I think it goes across all the alphabet therapies, there's a reluctance to work with people with real problems. The preference is for what really is the coaching client. People think of themselves as therapists doing therapy, but they generally recruit Jarvis clients who are people with disposable income, not very many problems, and really have quite low-level difficulties. Maybe a limiting belief here or there. Maybe they're not quite earning the money they wish they could and they want to up their income. Those kind of things. But the moment we get into the clinical disorders, whether it's real depression as opposed to pop psychology depression, real phobia and anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar, and all of those other psychiatrically diagnosed conditions, there tends to be a reluctance for practitioners to work with those people. Now, I don't know whether that's a good thing or bad thing. I guess it depends on the practitioner. And those who know me know well my views on the average practitioner of all alphabet therapies across the board. It's not good. So maybe it's better that they don't work with those people, and that those clientele, those patients actually see medical professionals. But then, of course, the moment we start looking at psychiatry, I have issues with that too, because it's terrifying what happens in psychiatry. Once you're into the system, once you have the diagnosis, once you're onto a compulsory treatment order, now you've got problems. You had problems before, now you've got compulsory treatment orders, and the system's got you. You've got a whole load more problems. One of the difficulties that NLP practitioners tend to express to me specifically is what do you do with the schizophrenic? How do you work with bipolar people? How do you work with clinically depressed people? Well, the same way you work with any person. Just because a person has a diagnostic label placed upon them doesn't mean there's anything different about their thought processes and how they think. They just do things in a different way to a greater degree with greater intensity. But it's not like they have a different brain structure entirely and are some alien and we're looking at a different physiology of a different animal. People think. It's just that some people think in more distressing ways than other people. And some people's thoughts are more distressing and not under any conscious control, which is probably true for everybody. How many of your thoughts occur to you and you didn't think them? It's like, where did that thought come from? And we have those things happen to us all the time. It's just that some people are bothered by it more, to a greater degree, for longer periods of time and with greater intensity. That's how I think of these things. But the moment somebody gets labelled with a psychiatric label and is on medication, the practitioner thinks, well, can I still do my NLP work with that individual? Why not? Why couldn't you? Now, in the Tinfoil Helmet chapter, I give an example of a guy. He had thought insertion. And this is a very common symptom within schizophrenia. And the thought insertion in his case was coming from the planet Uranus, although back in those days they hadn't really changed it, and we were still calling it Uranus, just for fun. And so this particular guy, he was quite elderly, and he was bothered by these thoughts that Uranus was projecting into his brain, and he had literally covered himself in tin foil to try and block that. It didn't work, and I kind of just quipped, really, well, maybe the foil's not big and thick enough. So he started reinforcing the helmet with more foil. Now, a colleague who was quite creative and quite an unusual character himself essentially just bellowed out of the window to tell Uranus to go away and leave this man alone, essentially, with a little bit of liberal swearing in there. And it worked. That was the most remarkable thing. This patient, never again reported any problems of thought insertion. My colleague shouted at Uranus out the window, and it seemed to have an effect. Now, I was quite taken by that, because that's a very unusual phenomena. Now, the patient doesn't stop being a patient. He doesn't stop being schizophrenic. But it did stop that particular symptom in quite a comical way, but it was very effective. Here is the thing I want you to consider if you're an NLP practitioner, and it is the issue of agency and boundary of self. Now, agency is where we give control or locus of control, using the psychological term, and an active process to something. So I'm the agency of my own thoughts. That particular patient had the planet Uranus as agency of some of his thoughts. And some people, the agency is TV, broadcasting specifically to them, giving them messages, and so forth. Now, I have a very strong sense of boundary between myself and the outside world. And different people have different strengths of boundary, but also distance of boundary. Now, I know, as an NLP practitioner, someone who's done a lot of this NLP stuff, I can make a picture in three-dimensional space. And it can be a memory, and it can be up there, and it's framed, and it's still picture, etc., etc. I can have my internal dialogue. Which direction does it come from? I can hear a conversation in my head, and if I think, okay, that I'm having a conversation with somebody, and if that somebody were here now, where would they be? Oh, they're here in front of me. Wow, okay, so we've got three-dimensional representation of aspects of self. So we literally have exterior representation of internal dialogue and internal experience. And kinesthetically, we can do the same thing as well. You can feel an atmosphere in the room. You can walk into the room and can feel the atmosphere. Well, the feeling is something that's happening externally. It's in the room itself. You have externalized that. The atmosphere is something you project out there. Sure, there's stuff happening in the room, but the feeling of it, that is something that's projected by you into the space of the room. Now, that's weird if you think about it, because then it will fill a certain distance and space. Maybe it goes out to the walls. Maybe it only goes out to a certain distance itself within those walls, or the boundary of those walls. Here is one of the things that the schizophrenic will have. They've lost the boundary between self and other. And so they have a difficulty putting agency to something they've just experienced. Did I do that? Or was it the filing cabinet that just did that? Did I do that? Or was it Uranus that just did that? The boundary between self and other is lost. But here it gets even weirder. So my boundary of self will typically go out, I think it's about wrist length for the average person. We have a personal boundary that when people we don't know or unfamiliar with step inside that personal space, we start to feel a little bit uncomfortable. Now, that's culturally defined. Different cultures have different distances of boundaries. And anyone that's travelled a lot around the world, you'll be familiar with this, especially when you're queuing. In some countries, people will quite happily be bumping into you constantly, and you're standing still in a queue. And I find that quite amazing. But sense of boundaries are very different in different cultures. And how we signal boundaries as well is also different. But that's a whole different matter. One of the things the schizophrenic will have is this sense of, has self hyper-inflated out into the world? So there's a difficulty differentiating between my projected experience and something that is actually has agency external. So it actually is another person. The filing cabinet really is talking. Or have I shrunk my boundaries so much that now the world is me? Or is it that I'm the world? So have I hyperinflated if I'm a schizophrenic, or have I contracted and constricted all the way down? Now, both of those things could be argued as being the mechanism by which the boundary and the understanding of whether that internal dialogue or that visual representation there is me or it's an apparition. And of course, if we just go with the apparition thing, people see ghosts. They don't exist. But people will utterly believe they exist because it's 100% true to their sensory perception. Sure, because they're the one who created it. They perceived it. But in that moment of experience, they didn't have a differentiation between projection of experience and that thing actually being out there. Because self had constricted away from it. They were constricted down so far, the projected experience is happening outside of me. Therefore, it is an external thing happening to me. It's not something I'm creating. Anyway, that's the point I just wanted to make for this particular chapter, just to add some additional details to the 3 subheadings that are within that chapter on submodalities. If you have any questions on this, any additional thoughts, do please stick them in the comment section below.